The moment the announcement broke, it sent an immediate shockwave through Washington and across global financial markets. Canada had just delivered an $850 billion trade shock that left the White House scrambling to respond. What had once been a steady and predictable economic partnership between two of the world's closest allies suddenly transformed into a high-stakes confrontation with enormous consequences. Inside government offices, emergency meetings were called. On Wall Street, traders watched screens flicker as uncertainty gripped the markets. And across industries dependent on cross-border trade, executives began calculating what this massive disruption could mean for their future. The scale alone was staggering. $850 billion tied to trade flows, supply chains, energy agreements, and corporate investments now hung in the balance. The move was swift, calculated, and impossible to ignore. For Donald Trump and his economic team, the pressure was immediate. For Canada, it was a statement that its economic leverage could no longer be underestimated. Within minutes of the news, analysts began using words like unprecedented, escalation, and economic shock. Investors scrambled to assess exposure. Currency markets reacted with volatility. The US dollar fluctuated as traders weighed the implications of a sudden and massive disruption to one of America's most critical trade relationships. In Ottawa, officials stood firm, signaling that this was not a temporary measure or negotiating tactic, but a decisive shift in economic strategy. The message was clear. The era of predictable trade assumptions was over. Before we go deeper into this dramatic showdown and uncover what led to this $850 billion trade shock and why the White House is scrambling to contain the fallout, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. These major political and economic battles are reshaping the global landscape in real time, and you won't want to miss what happens next as this story continues to unfold. At the center of this confrontation lies a sweeping economic action that directly impacts multiple industries across North America. Canada's move affects trade flows in manufacturing, natural resources, technology partnerships, and consumer goods. These sectors form the backbone of the economic relationship between the two nations. For decades, billions of dollars have moved across the border daily, supporting millions of jobs and stabilizing markets on both sides. The sudden disruption of such a vast network is more than a policy change, it is a structural shock. Inside the White House, advisors quickly gathered to assess options. Reports described a sense of urgency as officials examined potential countermeasures and diplomatic channels. Trump, known for his aggressive trade stance and willingness to engage in economic battles, now faced a situation that required both strength and precision. Responding too aggressively could escalate tensions further. Responding too cautiously could signal weakness. The balancing act was delicate, and the stakes were enormous. Financial markets reflected that uncertainty almost immediately. Major indexes showed signs of volatility as investors reacted to the news. Companies, heavily dependent on cross-border supply chains, saw their shares fluctuate. Energy firms watched closely as the possibility of disrupted exports and imports loomed. Manufacturing giants with operations spanning both countries began reviewing contingency plans. The interconnected nature of modern trade meant that no major sector was entirely insulated from the shock. Currency traders responded with rapid adjustments. The Canadian dollar experienced sharp movements before stabilizing, while the US dollar faced pressure from the sudden shift in trade expectations. Commodity markets also reacted. Oil and natural gas prices showed sensitivity to the possibility of altered energy flows between the two nations. Agricultural commodities, another cornerstone of cross-border commerce, faced uncertainty as exporters considered potential barriers and delays. For corporate leaders, the immediate challenge was clarity. Many companies rely on long-term contracts and stable regulatory environments to plan investments and operations. The sudden introduction of an $850 billion trade shock created a cloud of uncertainty that complicated decision-making. Should companies delay expansion plans? Should they seek alternative markets? Should they brace for potential tariffs or regulatory changes? These questions began dominating boardroom discussions. The political narrative surrounding the move quickly intensified. Supporters of Canada's decision framed it as a necessary assertion of economic independence and strategic leverage. Critics in Washington described it as an aggressive action that threatens stability and mutual prosperity. Media outlets on both sides of the border analyzed potential motives and consequences, fueling public debate about the future of the bilateral relationship. Diplomatic channels reportedly became highly active, even as public statements remained measured. Behind-the-scenes communication intensified. Negotiators sought to understand each side's objectives and explore possible paths toward de-escalation. Such discussions often involve complex trade-offs, balancing domestic political considerations with the broader need for economic stability. The challenge lay in finding a resolution that could satisfy both governments without triggering further market turmoil. Global markets watched with growing concern. The United States and Canada share one of the largest trading relationships in the world. Any disruption of this magnitude carries implications far beyond North America. European and Asian markets monitored developments closely, aware that instability between the two countries could influence global trade flows and investor confidence. International institutions began assessing potential ripple effects on economic growth forecasts. For American workers employed in industries tied to Canadian trade, the situation created anxiety. Jobs in manufacturing, energy, agriculture, and logistics depend heavily on stable cross-border commerce. If companies face increased costs or reduced market access, employment decisions could follow. Communities built around export-driven industries began paying close attention to every update from Washington and Ottawa. Canadian businesses also faced uncertainty. While the move demonstrated economic leverage, it carried potential risks. Escalating tensions with the United States could invite retaliatory measures affecting Canadian exports and investments. Leaders within Canada's business community urged careful navigation of the situation, emphasizing the importance of maintaining long-term economic stability even amid short-term strategic maneuvers. Investors sought signals about how long the disruption might last. Temporary measures often produce short-lived volatility. Structural shifts, however, can alter market dynamics for years. Analysts debated whether this $850 billion trade shock represented a negotiating tactic aimed at securing concessions or a deeper realignment of economic priorities. Each possibility carried different implications for markets and corporate strategies. Technology companies found themselves particularly attentive. Cross-border data flows, digital services, and technology partnerships form a rapidly growing segment of trade between the two nations. Any regulatory changes affecting these areas could reshape competitive landscapes and investment decisions. Firms with integrated North American operations began evaluating potential vulnerabilities and contingency plans. Energy markets remained a focal point. The United States and Canada share extensive energy infrastructure, including pipelines and electricity grids. These systems are designed for efficiency and mutual benefit, but they also create interdependence. Disruptions in policy or trade conditions can influence pricing, supply expectations, and infrastructure investment. Traders monitored developments closely, anticipating potential shifts in supply dynamics. Public reaction evolved as details continued emerging. Some viewed Canada's action as a bold demonstration of leverage in a complex global economy. Others worried about the potential for escalating trade conflicts that could harm consumers and businesses alike. In the United States, political leaders debated how best to respond while maintaining economic stability. The issue quickly became a focal point of national discussion. Media coverage intensified with continuous updates and expert analysis. Financial networks tracked market reactions in real time. Political commentators examined strategic implications. Social media amplified every rumor and statement, creating an environment of heightened attention and speculation. The narrative surrounding the $850 billion trade shock became one of the most closely followed economic stories of the moment. As the White House scrambled to formulate a response, the importance of timing became clear. Swift action could reassure markets and demonstrate leadership. Delayed decisions could prolong uncertainty and amplify volatility. Advisors weighed options carefully, considering both immediate market reactions and long-term strategic goals. Every potential move carried consequences that would extend far beyond the current moment. International partners observed the situation with keen interest. Many countries maintained trade relationships with both the United States and Canada. A prolonged conflict between the two could influence global supply chains and investment patterns. Some governments quietly prepared for potential shifts in trade flows, exploring opportunities to fill gaps or mitigate risks. The broader economic context added complexity. Global markets were already navigating challenges related to inflation, interest rates, and geopolitical tensions. Introducing a major North American trade shock into that environment heightened sensitivity. Investors became more cautious. Companies adopted a wait-and-see approach. Economic forecasts began incorporating new variables tied to the unfolding situation. Despite the tension, opportunities for resolution remained. Trade disputes often involve negotiation and compromise. Both nations have strong incentives to preserve the economic relationship that has delivered decades of growth and stability. Finding common ground, however, requires careful diplomacy and strategic flexibility. Public posturing must eventually give way to substantive dialogue. As hours turned into days, attention remained fixed on signals from both governments. Statements from officials were parsed for meaning. Market movements were analyzed for clues about investor expectations. Behind closed doors, negotiators likely worked through complex scenarios aimed at restoring equilibrium. The outcome would shape not only the immediate future of the $850 billion trade framework, but also the broader trajectory of US-Canada relations. What began as a single announcement had evolved into a defining moment for North American trade. Canada's decision to deliver an $850 billion shock demonstrated the power of economic leverage in an interconnected world. The White House's response would reveal how the United States intends to navigate such challenges moving forward. For businesses, investors, and citizens, the stakes could not be higher. In a global economy built on interdependence, stability is often taken for granted until it is suddenly disrupted. This confrontation serves as a reminder that even the strongest partnerships can face moments of intense strain. How leaders respond in those moments determines whether tension leads to transformation, escalation, or renewed cooperation. As the situation continues unfolding, one thing remains certain. The ripple effects of this $850 billion trade shock will be felt far beyond Washington and Ottawa. Markets, industries, and governments around the world will be watching closely, aware that the decisions made now could redefine the future of economic relationships in an era of increasing uncertainty.